Welcome everyone to today's webinar organised by Asia Society Australia and the Asia Society Policy Institute, titled The 2023 Quad Leaders Summit, What to Expect. My name is Dominique Fraser and I'm a research associate at the Asia Society Policy Institute, or ASPI, here in Australia. Now, I know we're all very eager to jump into the discussion, particularly given the news this morning, or that we received this morning in Australia, that President Biden has had to cancel his trips to Sydney and Canberra, as well as to PNG, because he has to go back to continue some very difficult negotiations with Congress on the US debt ceiling. But he will still make it to the G7 in Hiroshima. I'm very excited that we have 4 expert panelists join us today to talk through what is happening. We will analyse this recent news, but we will also spend a lot of time looking at what the Quad is and analysing the Quad, because one meeting, while important, does neither make nor break the Quad. But before we jump into all of this, a little bit of very important housekeeping. As is customary in Australia, I would like to acknowledge that many participants of today's webinar are joining us from territory that has traditional owners who never ceded sovereignty over these territories. I myself am joining from Meanjin, which we today call Brisbane. I live and work north of the river, where the Turrbal people are the traditional custodians of the land. I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people joining us today, and indeed any First Nations people who are joining today's webinar. Now, I'm sure everyone who is here today has a pretty good idea of what the Quad is, so I won't give a long lecture, but I will refer you to our dedicated Quad Central page, which you can find on the Asia Society Policy Institute's website, and we're sharing it now as well here in the Q&A box, or the chat box, so that you can check that out. On that page, each of our 4 panelists has written a view from their respective countries on what the Quad means to their country. Bates Gill, Executive Director of ASPI's Centre for China Analysis, is also giving a view on the Quad from China. And there is an exceptionally riveting background piece on what the Quad is written by myself. So please go check them out. You won't regret it. Now, we won't have a formal Q&A session today, but we will be monitoring the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have any questions, please pop your questions in there and we will do our best to answer them. Now to the good bit, our speakers. So as I said, we have speakers from the US, Australia, India and Japan joining us today. From the US, we're joined by Danny Russel. Danny is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Before joining ASPI, he had most recently served as the US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. From Japan, we're joined by Takako Hikotani. Takako is a senior fellow with ASPI in Tokyo. She's also a professor at Gakushuin University and concurrently a visiting professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. From Australia, we have Richard Maude, who is both a senior fellow at ASPI and the Executive Director of Policy at Asia Society Australia. He has previously served as Deputy Secretary, Indo-Pacific Group at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and as Director General of Australia's Office of National Assessments. Richard is also my boss, but I'll still be asking him the hard questions, don't worry. And last, but definitely not least, we're joined by Mohan from India. Well, currently in Stockholm, but usually based in India. Racha is an ASPI Senior Fellow in Delhi. He's also a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He was the founding director of Carnegie India in Delhi and is still associated with several leading Indian think tanks. Now, those very brief introductions don't do these panelists justice, so please go and check out their full bios by following the link in the chat box. Okay, that's enough for me. We'll start off the discussion. And Danny, I'd of course like to start with you, given the news that we received this morning, which is that President Biden can no longer join the Quad Summit in Sydney and has also had to cancel his trip to Canberra. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the G7 this year being about Russia and the Quad being about China. So should we read anything into the Biden administration's priorities, considering he's still going to the G7, or is this simply a matter of bad timing?
Well, thank you very much, Dom. And let me, before I begin, start with an apology to my Australian friends on behalf of the United States. So sorry, mates. Look, the fact is the G7 is on a weekend and the Quad was on a weekday, and President Biden had to get back. But no, look, in all seriousness, it's, I know, a disappointment for Australia, for Papua New Guinea. I actually, when I was in government, took Vice President Biden to Australia back in 2016 for a visit. So I know that it's a disappointment to him personally. But it's more than a disappointment for the United States. It's really an embarrassment. Something similar happened 10 years ago when the Republican Congress shut down the government and forced President Obama to cancel his attendance at APEC in Indonesia. And, you know, that was a setback, but it wasn't an end to the U.S. rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. So obviously it's damaging for domestic political brawl to spill over on the world stage. And I'm sure that the wolf warriors in various capitals are gleefully writing talking points about American unreliability and, you know, the dysfunction of American democracy. But look, number one, the stakes are very high. A U.S. default would be a global catastrophe. Second, I think that the fact that Biden is in fact leaving tomorrow for Asia as planned to meet with a host of world leaders, including the Australian and the Indian prime ministers, including the Japanese prime minister and others, to have bilateral meetings, to have a trilateral summit with Japan and Korea. I mean, I think that shows that there's no doubt about the commitment to the region and to multilateral diplomacy. I'd also, you know, remind ourselves that the work of the Quad has already been done, whether the leaders meet this week in Japan or postpone. There's a very substantial and significant record of progress on the range of issues that the Quad's been working on. So I don't mean to sugarcoat it. This is very unfortunate, but the demand signal for U.S. engagement in the region to support the countries of the Indo-Pacific, that's not going away. And neither is the determination of the Biden administration to bolster democratic values, prosperity, security in the region, and so on. So, look, we can expect the Biden team to double down on engagement with Australia, with the Pacific Islands, through the Quad and other formats, once the standoff with the House Republicans over the debt ceiling is settled.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thanks for reminding us what's at stake, really, as President Biden has to travel back. Richard, the Australian government will be disappointed. We've heard that word a few times. It has put a lot of effort and resources already into this summit. The most recent news that I've seen is that the Prime Minister Albanese is now in discussions with Delhi and Tokyo, but that the summit is still likely to go ahead with a senior representative from the US. So how is this news being received by the government?
Thanks, Dominique. I think you've put it pretty well. The government's going to be polite and understanding in public. Indeed, Prime Minister Albanese has been out on the media this morning, and that is exactly how he has been. But obviously, behind the scenes, there's going to be a great deal of disappointment. I think even if the meeting can go ahead, as you note, the Prime Minister has hinted it might, but there's still a lot of moving parts here, including who would sit in the chair and what Prime Ministers Kishida and Maude might like to do. I think one thing going for the meeting going ahead is that Prime Minister Maude has a bilateral visit lined up, and he's probably still keen to come and do that. But even if the meeting goes ahead, and no matter how senior the substitute sitting in the chair that the president would normally sit in, it just doesn't have the same impact. There's just an inevitability to that. In fact, in some ways, having someone other than Biden there, simply draws attention to the fact that the president couldn't make it. So the meeting loses impact, and Australia loses a very rare opportunity to host these three leaders in Australia at the one time, and also to host Biden, at least for now, for a bilateral visit. Biden was going to come to Canberra, as you said, and address the parliament. And as a former official, other than the sort of disappointment that the government might feel, spare a thought for all the Australian officials who've laboured very long and hard on policy, on content, on logistics and security to make all this work. As Danny said, the optics in the region for the United States are not terrific. I think, it's probably of small comfort to Southeast Asia, for example, that Biden is still getting to the region, quote unquote, but that's North Asia, not to Southeast Asia. And of course, Biden is not getting to PNG, so he's not getting that, what would have been a very historic first meeting by an American president to an independent Pacific country. And the mantra in the region is all about turning up. Turning up is half the battle. China turns up all the time, and so the optics aren't great. But I do agree with Danny that the Australian government needs to keep this in perspective, and I think they will. The very long contest ahead of us in the Indo-Pacific, the search for a balance of power favourable to our interest, or a strategic equilibrium, as the foreign minister calls it, is not going to be decided by one Quad meeting. The value of the Quad itself is not determined by a single meeting. And from an Australian government perspective, an American default is definitely the worse outcome. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I think, you mentioned China there. I haven't seen a reaction coming out of Beijing, but presumably they will, sort of portray this as the US being in disarray. But of course, as Danny pointed out, a potential US government default on its debts would be a much, much bigger deal than a cancelled summit meeting. Takako, President Biden is still travelling to the G7 in Hiroshima, coming up in a couple of days, as will Prime Ministers Albanese and Maude. Do you think the Japanese government will try to set some time aside for the four Quad leaders to meet on the sidelines of the G7?
Thank you, Dominique. Of course, the atmosphere in Japan is first a sigh of relief that Biden is still traveling to Hiroshima. But yet, I think the important question you raise is the one of what Japan can do to step up since that's happening, because as you point out, all four leaders will be in Japan at that moment. The time is limited, though, so they have to figure out a way, because they can't leave the other G7 countries aside, or the other guest countries, including Brazil, Indonesia, ROK, Vietnam, and other countries. So they have to figure out how exactly, but I do think that there must be some thinking going on about how that can happen.
Great. Thank you very much for those insights, Takako. And finally, Raja, President Biden has not only cancelled his attendance at the Quad Summit, but also his trip to Papua New Guinea, where he was set to meet Pacific Island leaders. How will New Delhi react to this news, as they'll just be starting to wake up to it? And I've also had a question here that reportedly Biden made a personal call to the Albanese government, or to Albanese, but not to Moape. And, what impact will this have? I mean, not expecting you to answer on behalf of Papua New Guinea, but how would this be seen from an Indian point of view?
Delhi is to wake up soon, and we'll have a reaction at some point. But as been said before, I mean, India the Prime Minister Modi has a visit lined up, a bilateral visit scheduled in Australia. There's good vibes these days between Delhi and Canberra, so I'm sure Prime Minister would want to go ahead with that visit. On Papua New Guinea too, I mean, Prime Minister Modi has a summit meeting with the Pacific Island leaders, so he would certainly go there. This is the first time he's going to Papua New Guinea either. So my sense is Mr. Modi would go ahead with his plans and see where it takes us. But I think given where the U.S. domestic dynamic and the stakes that we have at this point, I think the rest of the Quad, I'm sure, will take this in their stride and move on. So I think there's nothing. Finally, when it comes to the crunch, the domestic prevails or the external. But I think the work, as Danny said, it is official to prepare most of the documents. So I'm sure a lot of that work can be put out sooner than later.
Thank you very much, Raja. And thank you, Manik, for your question in the Q&A box. We will be getting to Quad expansion. And in the meantime, I'd like to refer you to the Quad Central page, where you can find the written views from each panelist today as well. And I know a number of them have mentioned the possibility of Quad expansion. But now for the more sort of, deep discussion on the Quad, moving away a little bit about this recent news. Danny, the first leaders, the statement of the first leaders summit, which happened in March 2021, was headed the spirit of the Quad. Can you give us an insight of what the spirit of the Quad is?
Well, if the U.S. diplomacy was as good as Japanese diplomacy, there would be a mascot of the Quad that would embody the spirit of the Quad, and we would all know the answer to the question. But Americans are lagging behind in that category. I think the spirit of the Quad has evolved in a couple of iterations. Dominique, you in your excellent introductory piece sort of characterized the different phases or the reboots of the Quad over time. I think that the spirit of the Quad started in the spirit of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. I think that it also had a short-lived experiment in kind of a new fashion of regional architecture. It had a very brief episode as a more overtly anti-China weapon. That was the spirit of former Secretary of State Pompeo, anyway. Now I would characterize the spirit of the Quad as altruistic. It's a collaborative project to provide public goods to the countries and the communities of the Indo-Pacific region by combining the respective strengths of the four countries in ways that make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And that the spirit also, I think, is reflecting the proof that democracies not only can deliver, but can in fact arguably outperform the Chinese in supplying things that the region wants. So by implication, there's a competitive element to the spirit. So, these are four very different countries. What they have in common seems to be the unifying force or the spirit of the Quad. As I said, it's altruistic. It's the idea that there's a shared responsibility to contribute to the greater good, and that the dream that they share isn't a selfish national dream. It's not, we're rejuvenating our nation at the expense of others, but it's about trying to shape the region and shape a world that everyone would truly want to live in.
Thank you very much, Danny. And I absolutely love the idea of a Quad mascot. I think we should put that as a challenge to the audience, see if anyone can come up with a great design. Takako, the Quad summit was meant to come hot on the heels of the G7 summit in Japan, which has, of course, been the big focus for the Japanese government. But the Quad is also important to Japan because, as you write in your View from Japan piece, it brings India in, keeps the US engaged, and forges closer ties with Australia. But is the Quad emblematic of a divided world in which like-minded countries cluster together to compete for influence?
Thank you, Dominique. I think the point that Danny just made is something I'd like to reiterate from the point of Japan as being important. That although the importance of what you just cited from my piece is very much there, I think it's not just for the competition factor. And that is another layer in Japan's diplomacy that is extremely important in their vision of the open Indo-Pacific. And for that, I think the part that was just mentioned about how democracies can deliver and how it's a way for Japan to bring together the four countries and bringing goods to the region or something for the better good of Indo-Pacific is the more competition, yet something more productive. And something that is more altruistic is a point that Japan would like to make. And I think that's reflected in recent statements by Prime Minister Kishida as well, in terms of what his new vision for the Indo-Pacific might be. And that I think is the spirit of what the Quad means for Japan as a platform to bring together the partners in the region for the Indo-Pacific vision that Japan's that is trying to promote, which is basically not just a competition, but also to prove that we can do something together for the region.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, this idea of needing to deliver public goods is very central to the Quad, as you say. Raja, India comes to the Quad with a long history of strategic autonomy. And you said something in your View from India piece, which I found very beautifully written. You say that India's strategic culture also includes a reluctance to make quick, bold departures and to rely instead on deliberate incrementalism. And at the same time, as you also note, India's national interests don't always align with those of other Quad members, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, of course, the big one at the moment. And, you sort of say that this is often the cause for India being seen as the weak link in the Quad. So what does India want the Quad to be? And is there enough alignment to keep the Quad going?
I think, as I said, look, this is the India's membership of the Quad and active participation in it is really an incremental advance that has taken place over the last 2 decades of India's expanding relationship with the US, as well as with Japan and Australia. So both the bilateral as well as a multilateral component has brought us here. My sense is 2 things have happened for India to be that have raised India's stakes in the Quad. Well, I think it is no secret that as China's assertiveness in the region has grown, India needs a structure, a balanced system in Asia. And I think that can only be built with the US and its allies in the region. As you said, about India's strategic autonomy, India is the only non-treaty ally in the Quad. So that's actually explains why it's important to have India in it. But India is not going to simply become an ally because it's participating in the Quad. So in India, that is an independent actor, a strong actor, joining hands with the US allies in a public goods providing framework, I think is good for India, is good for the US and its allies, because having a country like India, which is non-aligned, in this endeavor, I think makes the Quad a far more politically credible in the region, because otherwise the US could simply do this with its allies. The 3 of them could do this in Asia. But the fact that having India there is about lending it a depth and challenging those who think this is all America doing things in Asia. I think you have a leading Asian nation, which has long spoken for Asia, to be part of it, I think gives it a lot more substance than otherwise.
Great. Thank you very much, Raja. Let's turn to China, Richard. And there's also a question in the chat box, which I'll try to work into this question. So for Australia, China is our major economic partner. And of course, China objects to the Quad. In his piece on the View from China, Bates Gill writes that China's view of the Quad has gone from dismissive to derogatory to damning. And, what I want to ask you, what drives China's concerns about the Quad? And, the question in the chat box is, why hasn't India used the Quad to call out China? I think we can broaden that to, why isn't the Quad more openly critical of China?
Thanks, Dominique. Raja might want to weigh in on the India question, but let me answer very quickly on China, and then I'll also have a crack at a couple of the other questions, if you don't mind, just very quickly. I mean, Bates' piece is a beautiful short encapsulation of China's position on the Quad, so I do encourage people to read it. But China has a couple of major concerns about the Quad. First of all, it's very neuralgic about any opposition or a perception of opposition to its role and ambitions in the region. So it sees in the Quad several things. One is it sees a competitor for influence. So there is a big contest for influence, for economic gain, for security cooperation in the region. And the Quad's emphasis on the delivery of public goods into the region is squarely aimed at China, and China sees that. Beyond that, it does see, for all its comments about the Quad, a broad alignment among Quad members about the need to create a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific in which, as our foreign minister says, no one country dominates and no country is dominated. You know, China sees that intent. It may or may not be convinced about the Quad's ability to create that balance, but it doesn't like it. And the third thing that China doesn't like is that it also sees the ideational challenge that's implicit in the Quad. Australia, for a start, wears this cloak lightly. It doesn't talk about a competition of systems with China, as you sometimes hear President Biden say. But there's no doubt that this is a group of four democracies who are standing up for the rule of law, human rights, liberal values, and that, of course, is a challenge, an implicit challenge to the authority and legitimacy of one-party rule in China, and the party doesn't like it. Just very quickly on why doesn't the Quad call out China more clearly? Well, I think it does actually call out China fairly clearly, but, and this is where Raja might want to come in, it is conscious not to frame itself solely or even entirely as an anti-China bloc. And look, just very quickly on a couple of the questions on membership expansion, I don't see any of, this is Manik's question, I don't see any of the Quad members as having any great interest in membership expansion of the Quad, and certainly Australia doesn't. And I think there are probably three factors here. One is they want the Quad to remain small and effective. They don't want to get it large and unwieldy. They want to sustain a high degree of like-mindedness. That's one problem. Second, that all Quad members know that in Southeast Asia, there is concern, and we'll come to this a bit later on, about the Quad undermining ASEAN-centred architecture. The larger the group gets, the more acute those concerns are. And third, I think certainly in Australia, they have one eye on China. They know that China fears the idea of some kind of Indo-Pacific NATO or much broader opposing coalition. So I think those are the three reasons why Australia, at least, is not terribly interested in membership expansion.
Yes, Raja, please, your insights on China.
Look, I mean, why doesn't India call out, China in the Quad? My sense is I think there is an agreement among all the four members that, look, let's not make this a China bashing exercise. And that would actually make it harder, I think, for the Quad to gather wider support in the region. Because already, forget the China will always going to oppose whatever we do. But I think the rest of the region is what we should be concerned about, that you don't want to make it a two-power bloc. And I think that makes it harder for ASEAN and others in the region to engage with the Quad. But in terms of what India itself is doing, look, we have 50,000 troops deployed at 17,000 feet in a military face-off with China for the last 3 years. So I think those actions speak louder that when it comes to the ground level, India is standing up to China. But you don't want to make the Quad a China-focused organization. In fact, the challenge for us is to offer genuine possibilities for the rest of the region in terms of their economic development, in terms of their security enhancement. Those are the things we need to do rather than get locked into this is an anti-China forum. That's precisely what China wants. It's like walking into that trap if we take that kind of an approach to the evolution of the Quad. And I support Richard's thing about it's unlikely that the Quad will expand anytime soon. But I think the key is to look to see whether alternative ways of working with others, most notably South Korea or Indonesia, others. I think we should find ways to see if the ad hoc groups or other ways in which the subject-specific ad hoc arrangements, but those can be explored. But my sense is at this point, the focus will continue to be on deepening rather than on broadening the Quad.
Great. Thank you very much, Raja. Danny, I'll go to you. In your view from the US piece, you write that the Quad is a way to demonstrate that Washington and its partners have more to contribute to the region than just traditional security, which of course is often one of the criticisms leveled against the US. But with the focus on deterring China these days, is it likely the Quad will shift more into the defense space? And related to that, we have a question from the audience, which is, part of the question is, what can Quad as a grouping do more to counter China's aggression in the region?
Thank you, Dom. Well, look, as Richard and Raja have pointed out, the Quad's raison d'etre is to be true to and to focus on what it stands for: regional balance, democratic values, economic opportunities, technological advancement, and not to define itself in terms of what it's against. In the last Quad Ministerial, just back in March in New Delhi, the foreign ministers made a big point of stating clearly that the Quad is simply not a military grouping. It's not for security. It's not for military issues. Now, admittedly, if they look at the back of their Quad membership card, they'll notice that it actually says quadrilateral security dialogue, but okay, that's a technicality. I think looking objectively at it, there's no chance that the Quad is going to shift into defense issues. It's simply not a military arrangement. And I think that we can count on the Indians to ensure that the military cousin of the Quad, the annual Malabar exercise, remains separate. But remember, defense and deterrence are not identical. They're two different things. Deterrence has a lot more to do with psychology than with firepower. And so I think that without question, the fact that these important and powerful four countries have evolved an increasingly close partnership that's built on shared values, I think that actually serves as a deterrent to adventurism, to aggression, to problematic behavior, in this case, particularly by China. And I think that the strategy of not making the Quad a megaphone to blast China and denounce it, as Richard pointed out, is critical to winning acceptance and endorsement, if not just tolerance of the Quad in the region that has, let's say, bad experience with American being too blustering and too confrontational. I think the close coordination of these four very different countries in non-military areas like development and so on, I think it has the effect of making a would-be aggressor in the region less risk inclined. That's certainly my view. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thanks for reminding us about the difference of deterrence and defense. And maybe you'll just a comment that, on what the Quad is and what it isn't. So as you point out, it's not a military alliance. It's also not a trade bloc. It is a diplomatic partnership. And on that, Raja, I'd like to ask you, there's also a question from the audience, which is very similar, which starts off with, the Quad's focus is on delivering public goods. And when it comes to delivering public goods, is the Quad working? Is it delivering these public goods? And is it contributing to a balance of power in the region?
I think over the last 2 years, since we begun the leaders level meetings, there was during the pandemic there was a focus on producing vaccines and delivering them to the region. A part of that promise was fulfilled. I mean, it could have been a lot better, but within the circumstances, there was vaccine production and delivery of the vaccines to the Indo-Pacific region. Second, I think at the last summit in Tokyo, they've talked about maritime security. It's really a gray zone. I mean, it's not non-security, or it is like military security of pulling together the resources of the 4 members in space and maritime domain to be able to assist the smaller countries in the region to prevent illegal and unauthorized fishing in the waters, so that helping them get better control of their own waters. And I think that is one of the important things today, that the Quad stands for the sovereignty of states in the region, especially after what's happened in Europe, Russia brazenly violating the sovereignty of Ukraine. That what Japanese Prime Minister says, Ukraine is the future of Asia, that the danger that this might empower, countries to unilaterally seize territories of their neighbors. Some of that has already been happening in South China Sea, in the Himalayas. So I think coming together to stand up for the sovereignty of the smaller states, that in itself, I think, is a very important advance. And I think that gives a lot of strength for smaller countries to be able to stand up, to engage, and to look the aggressors in the eye. So that is a major contribution, I would think. And I think we got a long way to go. But within the public goods, there is also the talk about today working together on critical and emerging technologies in terms of providing alternative funding. Japan has done that for quite some time in terms of infrastructure development. In the last few weeks, the US has announced a new initiative for infrastructure support, infrastructure development support, and India does its bit in its own neighborhood, and Australia does it in the Pacific Islands. So I think pooling those resources to be able to offer credible alternatives to Belt and Road Initiative, those kind of initiatives, I think, have a longer term impact. So I think my sense is the Quad should stick to substantive long-term outcomes rather than posturing for sake of posturing at this point of time.
Great, thank you very much, Bacha. And as promised, we are going to talk about Quad expansion. Richard has already given Australia's views on the potential risks of any possible expansion. But of course, there's not just suggestions that the Quad formally expands membership, but as Racha mentioned, South Korea, for example, has been brought up a few times in terms of bringing them into the Quad fold through, for example, a dialogue partner or as a member of an ad hoc working group. Takako, the relationship between Japan and South Korea seems to be thawing or has been thawing. And how does Japan see any possible involvement of South Korea in the Quad, be that through formal membership or through more informal arrangements?
Yes, I think that if Japan is going to include or try to reach out to ROK, should be, or it's more likely to be through the informal, not as a formal member of the Quad. You're completely correct. We're at a very important time for Japan-ROK relationship, and it is time to institutionalize what's going on right now so that it will continue. But I think in terms of the type of arrangements for institutionalization, I think the priority for Japan might be on the trilateral front more than through the Quad. Either both in terms of defense, trilateral discussions about nuclear deterrence, building upon the new bilateral nuclear consultative group announced during UN's visit to DC is one thing. And also trilateral coordination during regional crises is something that should be done on a trilateral basis. I think that's a better fora. And also economic, to regularize a trilateral dialogue on economic security that began in February. Those are the things that I think Japan is thinking in terms of institutionalization. I guess for the Quad, also one thing to add is that I mentioned in the piece that I wrote that Foreign Minister Hayashi has said something quite interesting, is that the Quad is like a soft version of Beatles, the members are fixed and close, but each member can act solo. And so I think that's how Japan wants to keep it, that as a Quad, they like the membership as is, and they like the flexibility of the Quad as is, but it's extremely important, once again, to institutionalize the relationship we have with ROK. And I think that could be done either through trilateral, but also through the working groups that Raja has mentioned and Richard has mentioned that the Quad can actually build upon.
I love the quad as a beetle analogy. Maybe there's scope there for some soft diplomacy around one of those viral TikTok videos. Anyway, my mind is going somewhere weird now. Takako, let me just, sorry, Danny, do you want to answer? Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to ask Takako, who is Yoko in his Beatles metaphor?
I thought the Yoko, that might be like the fifth person, but anyway, I think Japan is happy to be either Paul or George or whoever.
Takako, let me stay with you for 1 second. I'll ask you a bit of a more serious question. We have a question in the chat box about any possible future cooperation between NATO and the Quad. And the background to this question, of course, is that NATO has been reaching out more to its 4 Indo-Pacific partners, and in particular Japan, with offices being opened across those countries with respect to Japan. So do you think there is any future prospect for cooperation between NATO and the Quad? And let's keep in mind that the Quad is not a military alliance.
Right. I think you kind of answered my question, but at the end of your sentence, that since the Quad is not equivalent to NATO in any way, it's really, if this is going to happen, maybe, although, as Danny reminded us, the Quad does still include the name security. And the name, I think we have moved on from Quad to be just that. And I don't really think that the current platform we have is something that can be equivalent or adjacent or something that we can build upon with NATO. But and I think that's how Japan sees it. I don't think they'll see Japan on the Quad as something. There is a lot of work between NATO and Japan, and I think it's a good development in terms of the Indo-Pacific efforts of the NATO. But I don't think Quad will be the counterpart in Japan's mind.
Thank you very much, Takako. Richard, let's get to sort of regional perspectives a little bit more. You write in your View from Australia piece that the Quad is about giving the region, and in particular Southeast Asia, choices, so that countries don't completely drift into China's orbit. Because as you said, while the US sometimes doesn't show up, China and other countries usually do. And this is something that Takako also mentioned. So in terms of giving the region choices is really important to the Quad members. So how does the broader region, and in particular Southeast Asia, how do they see the Quad? What do they make of it? Do they see it as giving them more choices?
Thanks, Dom. Well, I think they see it potentially gives them more choices, but to go to one of the excellent questions that one of our listeners submitted, I do think the jury is out on whether Southeast Asia really feels that the Quad is yet delivering to its full potential into the region. And I think when Southeast Asia thinks about the Quad, they don't really just think about the Quad. The Quad sits in a context which is making Southeast Asia fairly anxious. And that context, of course, is a fundamental shift in the strategic environment across the Indo-Pacific. And Southeast Asia, in many ways, sits right at the centre of that. So we have much tougher competition for influence between China and America's partners in China in Southeast Asia. There's a much more adversarial relationship between China and America. The risks of a conflict, notably over Taiwan, are seen to be rising. And ASEAN also knows that America is leading an effort to build the fabric of military deterrence around the Indo-Pacific, and that Japan and Australia in particular are large parts of that, both making some fundamental shifts to their defence posture, including the search for more lethal military with longer range strike capability. And AUKUS, of course, in Australia sits right at the heart of that. So the Quad is kind of emblematic, if you like, of those fundamental shifts. And ASEAN worries about three things. First of all, they worry about a conflict because economically their trade is heavily geared to China. They know how devastating a conflict would be. Secondly, they don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. Southeast Asian countries, even ones that are close to America, consistently make this point. They value their autonomy in the region and they don't want to pick a side. And thirdly, they do worry that the region's architecture, the regional architecture, which is centred on the Association of Southeast Asians, like the East Asia Summit, for example, or the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting, will be sidelined by these new groupings. That's not to say they won't be central, but that the broader region, America and Australia and Japan, will still turn up, but just that ASEAN will be irrelevant, or certainly much less relevant to the great challenge of the age, which is how to manage a rising China and how to manage competition between China and America. Now, Quad members, including Australia, have put a lot of work into reassuring Southeast Asia about what the Quad is and what it is not. And I think Southeast Asia is partly reassured about that. But still, these lingering concerns do persist. And Southeast Asia knows that really the momentum, the real action, is actually now outside these ASEAN-centred processes. And they also know that some of the things that have kept Southeast Asia together in ASEAN, 10 very different countries, soon to be 11, things like the consensus principle, make it quite hard for forums like the East Asia Summit to really play an active role in managing great power competition in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Richard, for summing up those concerns that the region has. Racha, I see you would like to add something.
Yeah, briefly. I mean, you get two kinds of views. One which says Quad is a threat to the existing regional architecture, will undermine ASEAN unity. On the other hand, there are those who say, look, what have we done lately? Really, so what is the purpose of Quad? So I think you have both these views. My sense is, look, Quad originally started in 2007. It went moribund till 2017. We've seen the 2 years of summit-level engagements. My sense is it is beginning to cohere. And if the summit had convened, I mean, we would have seen probably some new initiatives. I think this idea is, look, you have done nothing in the last 2 years, so why do I need you? Is really not a credible argument. I think these kind of intergovernmental organizations are going to take time. And my sense is bit by bit, you're going to see new initiatives develop. The other part is that you don't need the Quad to be everywhere together. I mean, I think that point has been made before. If Japan and United States want to work closely with Philippines, that's easier, that's geographically convenient, and they can do things. If India and Australia can do things in the Eastern Indian Ocean, there are things that can be done. So my sense is, as long as these four countries hang together, coordinate, collaborate in making the region more secure, that I think is a positive advance. There was a question on NATO, if I might just say that I don't think India is either, any particular view on NATO's engagement with Asia, with Indo-Pacific. We've seen NATO before in Afghanistan, where that was not a particularly successful venture of NATO's participation in Afghanistan. But today, I think it was Japanese idea that, look, we need to bring the Europeans in. So at the fundamental level, given the scale and the scope of the challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific, having the Europeans contribute to regional security is a good idea. But at this point, of course, Europe is preoccupied. And my sense is there will be, big challenges for Europe to first overcome the Russia question in Europe. But I think US has made it clear that it would like the Europeans to contribute more. Meanwhile, let me say something, whether NATO comes to Asia or not, I mean, Asia is getting into Europe. That is the new thing. You have Iranian drones. You have China backing Russia in a big way on the European security issues. In fact, China blames NATO for what's happened. And more interestingly, I would say South Korea is selling arms to to Poland. So I think this idea, these two are somehow completely separate theaters. That age is gone. I mean, so the interpenetration of the two regions is already happening. A Chinese expansion into Europe, a NATO's engagement with Japan. Now they're going to have an office here. So I think we got to live with this, interconnection between the two theaters getting stronger in the coming decades, coming years.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Raja. I know you're currently in Europe, so good perspective there. I also like the reminder that, not everything has to be a Quad initiative. There are still bilateral and multilateral things that Quad members can do outside of the Quad. Danny, I saw you had your microphone unmuted. Would you like to add something to this? You're currently on mute, sorry.
Sorry, on the issue of Southeast Asian views about the Quad, I very much agree with both Richard and Raja's observations. I'd add that ASEAN's concern about its sort of pride of place in the region as this sort of central locus of Southeast Asia is about a lot more than just pride. ASEAN has served as the kind of binding mechanism that has prevented conflict from among these 10 countries who have historical grievances, border disputes, etc. You could make the case that without ASEAN, the region would look a little more like the Middle East than the very peaceful and prosperous area that it is. By the same token, ASEAN as a regional institution has served as the platform where major powers engage in the region. And Southeast Asian countries have a very legitimate concern about the risk of US-China rivalry getting out of control. They understandably see themselves as the grass that's going to be trampled by elephants. So if they look somewhat askance or with some anxiety at a grouping that is made up of kind of one side of the equation, not including China and not with the ballast of ASEAN, I think we can understand why they want to be convinced that the Quad is actually serving a stabilizing and not a destabilizing function.
Great. Thank you very much, Danny. And unfortunately, we are rapidly approaching the end of this webinar. So I would like your quick thoughts in a sort of fire round at the end here. I want to know where the Quad should go from here. As Raja mentioned, there are maybe sometimes unfair questions of what has the Quad done lately. So what should the Quad do from now? Takako, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Dominique. I was going to ask Richard that question since you're the host, because I think one thing in terms of the sequence was that Japan was last year's Quad Summit meeting, and we're supposed to see what that brought out, and the handover would have been to Australia. But I do think what's important, just to go back to a couple of points that were raised, is that there's no functional equivalent to the Quad, I think. So we need to be to have a different view about whether it's about how it's going to bring countries together, and that it's also evolving. And I think it really reflects the geopolitical environment at that time, each time we go. So I'm just going to say pass. I think the Tokyo spirit was to try to come up with something we can do constructively together. It was very practical in nature, and I think that's the general thrust. So, but I'd like to ask Richard how you see this Quad Summit and how it should proceed going forward. But I think we're still on the practical side, bringing the strength together rather than, and not to highlight the differences in a way that we don't have to.
Good. Richard, over to you.
That's a hospital pass, as we say here in Australia. Look, the government, the Australian government has been tight-lipped on what kind of announceables, as the phrase in the trade is, might come out of the summit. And as far as I was aware, I haven't seen any leaks out of any of the other capitals either. Now, I'd be surprised if there isn't something there. Of course, in Tokyo, there was a very big announcement on maritime domain awareness, a great idea, but again, going back to that problem of delivery, it's not clear to me just how much is operational at this stage and when it might be. So, I'm sure we will see enough for the Quad to show momentum, and Australia will want that. But I do think, if you listen to the way in which the government talks about the Quad, they get this point about delivery. Australia is quite comfortable with the current shape of the focus of the Quad. It really wants to keep the focus on the delivery of public goods and doing practical things in the region, and being seen to deliver. So, my sense is a bit of a sense of consolidation with a focus on doing practical things in the region is where Australia wants the meeting to come out.
Right. Raja, where should the Quad go from here?
I think just the very presence of the Quad, that as a grouping that is vibrant and continues to, move forward, that itself has a value, I would say. So if you just look at the last 2 years, instead of saying what exactly has Quad done, but if you look at the 4 countries individually, the US, notwithstanding all the criticism that will come its way for not joining not traveling to Australia, look at how much the US has done in the last 2 years. I think the relationship with the Philippines is transformed. It has encouraged Japan and Korea to come together. Its outreach to the Pacific Islands has taken place. So this idea that the US does not care for the region is fundamentally untrue. Similarly, Australia has stepped up, the Pacific step up in the region. India is doing a lot more in its own backyard. And the Japanese role, we've seen Japan come all the way to Africa, Japanese Prime Minister. So if you see collectively what the 4 countries are doing in the region, their individual efforts are pretty significant in the last 2 years, I would say. So the Quad, the AUKUS, and the national efforts they put together, I think, together provide the basis that, look, this is not going to be a unipolar region. This will have substantive inputs by other actors other than China. So that itself, I think, is an advance for countries in the region to see that there are alternatives, there are forces that you can turn to. So that itself, I think, is a psychologically and politically a huge contribution. So I would say, try and, don't try to do too many things. Try and do fewer but significant things. Review what we've announced all these years. But step up coordination, political strategic coordination between the 4 countries in the region. That itself, I would think, would be a huge contribution.
Thank you, Raja. And Danny, the last word goes to you. And what?
Okay.
Should do from here, from a US perspective?
Great. Well, I very much agree that the key for the Quad is delivery, and not just delivery, but also telling the story of what is being achieved and highlighting the benefits to the non-Quad countries. I think that's going to carry a lot more weight than rolling out new promises. If there is going to be kind of a new destination, new strategy for the Quad, I think that what would be ideal would be for the 4 countries to find ways to involve and to leverage the private sector more closely. These are 4 free market and innovative economies. They represent, a third of global GDP, and ultimately it's companies, not governments, that create wealth, that provide investment and know-how, and basically provide what the region needs. So a demand-driven strategy, by necessity, will involve the private sector. That's my advice.
Thank you very much. And if I can weigh in, I really want to come back to this idea of the Quad through music and the Quad mascot. I'm very disappointed none of you mentioned that. So thank you very much to Danny, Takako, Richard, and Raja for your valuable insights today. That brings us to the end of today's webinar.